Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Paul D'Ambrosio, and I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University, where the 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project is based. I want to welcome you all to our 24th roundtable and our 80th event since 2022. Today, we are hosting a discussion of paradox in the Zhuangzi. Our invited discussants are Professors Jason Dockstader from the University College Cork, Zhu Jinjing from Nanjing University, and Daniel Sarafinas from East China Normal University. Our chair today is Dimitra Amarantidou from Shandong University. It has become a tradition here at 四海为学 to give younger scholars a chance to be part of high-profile academic events by inviting them to take part as chairs or discussants. So if there are any younger scholars in the audience who wish to be part of future events, please let me know. This event will be 2 hours total, ending promptly at 10 a.m. Beijing time. Before getting things started and handing them over to Professor Dimitra, I want to say a few things about the 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Academic Forum. The 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the less productive conventional practices sometimes found in contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we are not interested in male peacocks and jerks, or in any form of egoism or self-promotion. We hope to curb all types of aggressive and "look at me, I'm smarter than you," or "don't I know so much," and similar attitudes sometimes found in academic exchanges. We might even go so far as to say that we hope to be a counterbalance for the negative attitudes often found in so-called blind reviews. While there is certainly a time and a place for anonymity, or at least the appearance of anonymity, communication in academia should have just as much time and place for speaking to one another in more congenial and community-forming settings. The neologism 四海为学, which was created by Robin Wong, is a play on 四海为家, and we hope to keep this idea of 四海为家 at the foreground of all of our events. The 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project seeks to accomplish these shifts in orientation during academic exchange by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions, and responses that are open and honest. We hope to foster environments where people truly learn from and with one another. So, before introducing our chair, I want to thank everyone for being here, and I want to especially thank the speakers for taking their time to prepare and share with us today. Our chair is Professor Dimitra Amarantidou, who is Associate Professor of Chinese Philosophy at the Advanced Institute for Confucian Studies, Shandong University. She is also the editor of the international edition of Wenshizhe. She holds degrees from the University of Athens, Nanjing University, and East China Normal University. Her research focuses on early Chinese philosophy, particularly irony, humor, and paradox, as well as the hermeneutic function of the image of Confucius and the relationship between sageliness, self-cultivation, and arrogance. Her monograph, Irony in the Analects, is forthcoming with Routledge, and she is co-founder and co-director of Geju Dongjian, the Chinese-Greek philosophy forum, and the book review editor for China and Southeast Asia for Philosophy East and West. Thank you very much. Dimitra, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Paul. Can you hear me well? Yes? Thank you very much for organizing this, and thanks to everyone. This topic is obviously very interesting for me, and I think for many people. So let me start by introducing our three wonderful speakers. I personally very much look forward to this discussion. So I will start with Jason. Dockstader, who is a lecturer in the Department of Philosophy at the University College Cork, Ireland. His research interests are in Asian philosophy, metaethics, and metaphysics. Our next speaker is Zhu Jinjing, Associate Professor at the Center for Chinese Thinker Studies, Nanjing University. She received her PhD from Cornell University and MA and Bachelor from National University of Singapore. She works on early Chinese philosophy and comparative philosophy between Chinese and Greek traditions. Her current work focuses on the Zhuangzi and the Book of Ritual, seeking to bring Taoist metaphysics and Confucian socio-political thought into dialogue. And our third speaker for today is Daniel Sarafinas. He is from lovely Windham, New Hampshire, and he received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Macau in 2020. He currently serves as an associate research professor in the Department of Chinese Philosophy at East China Normal University in Shanghai, where he teaches in the International Graduate Program. His areas of research include Lao Chuang thought, early Chinese political thought, the five classics, philosophic critique, and issues surrounding collective identity. As a translator, he has translated the works of Chinese scholars such as Li Zihou, Sun Zhongyuan, and Yang Guorong. So I welcome Jason, who has 10 minutes to present, and we will follow with comments from the other two speakers. Jason, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks a lot. And thanks for the invitation. So I'm going to talk about Zhuangzi value paradox today. So I'm mostly going to talk about this issue of value paradox and the Zhuangzi through the debate between value monism and value pluralism. I'll argue that the text contains a paradoxical form of value monism. So if the question is, does the Zhuangzi defend value pluralism or value monism? My answer will be yes. Philosophers usually try to resolve paradoxes by dissolving them. I don't think that's the Zhuangzian approach. The text indulges in and affirms paradox. So if a paradox is not rendered safe for classical logic, it becomes a true contradiction, a dialetheia. If a contradiction is not contained by a paraconsistent logic, it threatens explosion. Every contradiction, and thereby every proposition, becomes true. This is trivialism. I won't focus on that consequence too much today. Instead, I'll ask what values would need to be like if every value judgment were true. This brings us to the Zhuangzi's paradoxical value monism. So most scholars read the Zhuangzi as value pluralist. It rejects fixed standards, universal hierarchies, and final answers. It emphasizes diverse perspectives, transformations, and fluid adaptation. On this view, the text affirms many values, none absolutely superior to the rest. I accept this, but the text also contains a distinct monism. This is not a monism that eliminates plurality. Rather, each particular thing or value is, in a certain sense, identical with the whole. I call this one-all monism, and when applied to value, one-all value monism. So I'll proceed in three stages. First, I'll explain the standard value pluralist reading. Second, I'll show why standard monism and pluralism are inadequate. And third, I'll present one-all value monism as an alternative. So let's begin with value pluralism. In contemporary value theory, the debate usually concerns how many intrinsic values there are. An intrinsic value is valuable in itself, not merely as a means to something else. A value monist says there's ultimately one fundamental intrinsic value. Other things are valuable in relation to that ultimate value. A value pluralist says that there are many fundamental values, irreducible to a single source. So many readers of the Zhuangzi take it to be value pluralist. Chad Hansen, David Wong, and Chris Fraser, for instance, emphasize its plurality of perspectives and standards. The text offers no universal criterion for judging everything. Instead, different beings, situations, and practices have their own standards of rightness. The key idea is the distinction between sure and fei, this and not this or that, right and wrong, good and bad. Values are not abstract principles outside the world. They are perspectives or distinctions. To value is to draw a line between this and that, appropriate and inappropriate. On Fraser's reading, the Zhuangzi presents a heterogeneity of value. Many sources of value, each tied to contexts and forms of life. The sage does not discover one correct value and impose it everywhere. The sage wanders among perspectives, adapting without clinging to a fixed standard. This reading captures something important. The Zhuangzi affirms many perspectives, ways, values, and transformations. But pluralist readings often reject monism too quickly. They assume that monism must exclude plurality. Since the Zhuangzi affirms plurality, they conclude that it cannot be monist. I think this is too narrow. Contemporary metaphysics can help clarify this point. Existence monism says only one concrete thing exists. Everything else is illusion or modification. This is not the Zhuangzi because the text does not deny the many. Priority monism says the whole is more fundamental than its parts. Priority pluralism treats the parts as more basic than any whole. Most pluralist readings are implicitly priority pluralist. They make many things or values more basic than any unity. But the Zhuangzi fits neither priority monism nor priority pluralism. It makes neither the one nor the many more fundamental. It equalizes one and many. So this brings us to one-all monism. The idea is that each thing is both itself and the whole. Each part is not merely part of the whole. In a certain sense, each part is identical with the whole. Likewise, the whole is not separate from or superior to its parts. The whole is each thing, and each thing is the whole. This is strange and paradoxical, but it fits the Zhuangzi well. The textual basis appears especially in the second chapter, equalizing assessments of things. There, the text challenges oppositions between this and that, right and wrong, one and many. Every this is also a that, every that is also a this. A perspective distinguishes itself from what it is not, yet depends on what it excludes. Each perspective, therefore, contains the field of distinctions from which it emerges. A this is constituted by the that's it rejects, depends upon them, and transforms into an away from them. Reality is not merely interconnected. It is simultaneous identity and difference. Things differ, but they're also one, because each difference opens into all the others. So this is where the Tao matters. The Zhuangzi speaks of the Tao as the axis or hinge of perspectives. The Tao is not one perspective above the others, but the pivot through which perspectives arise, transform, connect, and become one another. The sage moves with this axis and does not force unity, because things are already unified in their differences, indeed identical as different. This helps explain lines like heaven and earth are born together with me, and the 10,000 things and I are one. This does not deny plurality. They claim that each thing as itself is identical with the whole field of things. This is one-all monism. Each one is all. Now apply this to value. If values in the Zhuangzi are perspectives, distinctions, or Taos, then each value draws a line between this and that, right and wrong. Each value affirms itself as right and treats what differs from it as wrong. But every wrong is also right from another perspective. Thus, every value is connected with and ultimately identical to all other values and disvalues. The Tao then is not one value among others, nor a highest value that reduces all others to instruments. It is the value access of all values, the way each value generates itself and relates to every other value. It is the one value that is all values and disvalues. This is one-all value monism. Each distinct value is both one value among many and the one ultimate value. Every value is intrinsically valuable, not because there are many unrelated ultimate values, but because each value is the Tao, the whole field of value from its own perspective, and paradoxically, from all perspectives. We can therefore preserve what is right about value pluralism while also defending monism. The pluralist is right that the Zhuangzi affirms many values. No ordinary value, such as pleasure, virtue, knowledge, or even wandering, reduces all the others. But the monist is also right that there is oneness. All values are one because each value is the Tao. The Zhuangzi therefore equalizes value monism and value pluralism. It does not choose one against the other. Pluralism is true because there are many distinct values. Monism is true because each value is the one ultimate value. This is an affirmed paradox, a true contradiction. This also changes the ethical message. On a simpler pluralist reading, the sage adapts to many values and contexts. This remains true. But on the one-all modus reading, wandering is more radical. The sage does not merely move from one value to another. The sage sees each value as the whole, each perspective as the Tao, each this as the one that is all that's. The therapeutic point here is crucial. The Zhuangzi is not only making a metaphysical claim, it tries to transform how we live. We suffer when we cling to one perspective, one value, or one distinction between right and wrong. But if each thing is already the one that is all things, then we can stop forcing unity and thus wander more freely. This is not mild relativism or simple contextualism. To wander is not merely to passively adapt. It is to identify with the spontaneous, self-differentiating movement of the Tao, and to recognize each perspective as the excess of all perspectives. So to conclude, I've challenged the consensus that the Zhuangzi should be read simply as value pluralist. I agree that it affirms many values, perspectives, and ways of life. But this plurality is inseparable from a fundamental oneness inherent in each and all things. The Zhuangzi does not defend existence monism because it does not deny the many. It does not defend priority monism because it does not make the whole prior to the parts. It does not defend priority pluralism because it does not make the many prior to the one. Instead, it offers one-all monism. Each thing is the whole, and the whole is each thing. Each is the one that is all. Applied to value, this becomes one-all value monism. Each distinct value is the one ultimate value while remaining one value among an infinitely many others. This reading shows the Zhuangzi as both pluralist and monist without reducing either side. Its deepest move is not to choose between one and many, but to equalize them. Each one is all. Each value is the Tao. The sage sees this, affirms it, and thus wanders accordingly. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you very much for this wonderful overview. Now, please, Jinjing, could you please make comments? You have 8 minutes.
Can you hear me, everyone?
Very well, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Jason, for this wonderful talk. I think I'm on the same ground as you to say that all these paradoxes, especially the paradox of one and many, should not be dissolved. Because I think, for one thing, as for the paradox to exist in the first place, I think we have to hold these two ends. We cannot say that one end totally dominates the other, so that the other end totally diminishes. That's not what we want to say. So we do see in the Zhuangzi there are a lot of paradoxes, especially the paradox of one and many. There's a tendency to go for the many perspectives and things, and there's also the tendency to go for the kind of oneness, the whole thing together. So I don't think any of the two ends should be dismissed. So, and that on that basis, we have this paradox holding strong rather than dismiss this paradox and choosing one. There are several questions I would like to ask. That's perhaps not only a question for you, perhaps also a question for myself. That is to say, I wonder how would you understand this one, the one or the whole? Because as far as I read the Zhuangzi, sometimes we see the whole as the whole collection of all the individual things, all the individual perspectives. In that sense, the whole seems to me to be a cosmological totality rather than a transcendental kind of oneness. So I'm wondering what's your take for this one, this whole, whether it's cosmological or whether this is transcendental. I think this is crucial because it makes us to wonder whether the Zhuangzi or the whole Chinese philosophy, the Tao, whether it's a metaphysical Tao or whether it's a cosmological one. So that's one question for what's the one, the whole. How do you understand this? And then my second question would be, if we go for strict, I think we can all understand paradox, no problem. But I try to think from an opponent perspective. Let's say if we want to deploy strict logics, then one might say that it is one thing to say each thing contains the whole, and then it is another thing to say each thing is the whole. There's some kind of jump between to say one thing contains its opposite and contains the whole. And that's another thing to say one thing is the opposite and one thing is the whole. There's some kind of logical jump between these two steps. I know it is very crucial in the Qi, especially the Qi chapter, this debate between the duality of this and that, and the Dao Shu is the kind of reducing this duality into some kind of equalization or balancing or even oneness, some kind of like this. But I'm wondering, there's always some kind of jump between to claim it contains it. It is like potentially contains it, and it is another thing to say it is it. And to make this jump, I think seems to be quite crucial in your argument to say that one contains all and all is in the one. All these two bilateral things. So I think I will just give these two questions. I would like to hear your view about this.
Thank you, Jingjing. Jason, would you like to respond?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's great stuff. Thank you very much. Yes, how to understand the one. So you set it up as understanding the one either cosmologically as a kind of cosmological totality or as more of like a metaphysical transcendental. So my first instinct was to treat it more cosmological. Yeah, I mean, the way I understand it is that there's nothing outside, in a sense, left out as a remainder in the Zhuangzi worldview there. So the one, the whole, it simply is the cosmological totality, sure, yeah, but it's also each part, it's each concrete particular. Let's put it in those terms, right? I want to say something like the Tao is the concrete particular that each concrete particular is, or each thing is, right? So I don't think it's going to be, in a sense, a whole that is more than or other than its parts, right? My only move here is to go from mere many one identity, right, where the whole is the parts taken collectively, to a position I'm trying to call one all identity, where the whole is each part taken in itself, right? Not all the parts taken collectively, but each part is the whole somehow. That's the impression I get from the Zhuangzi. I should admit that my reading is a bit impressionistic. I don't have a smoking gun here. I think that I'm just trying to make interpretive moves and kind of draw out, I think, certain consequences from what's happening, especially in chapter two. So for the first question, yeah, I think my answer would be to say that something like cosmological totality is a better understanding of the whole or the one than any sort of transcendental or metaphysical in the sense of transcendent view. But if I was to be truly consistent here, I would have to say that that very distinction itself contains within itself both sides, right? That's another sure fei that's going to contain all the feis within it. So this is the danger of this sort of reading, that if it becomes self-reflexive and self-applicable, you end up having to affirm a whole number of other paradoxes and contradictions. So I couldn't completely say no, right? That the transcendental reading is false or something like that, right? Um, on the second question, yes, that's a key point, right? Being versus containment, right? Is everything contained in everything else? Is each thing containing everything within it, right? Is everything entailed by each thing such that everything that's entailed by it is within it? I think that's all true, but I do make the next step where I say that makes them identical in some key sense. But identity in what sense? Yeah, that's the hard part, because it's an identity which is identical to difference, right? So I think I get there by following someone like Brooks of Horn and reading things as being so fundamentally, intrinsically transformative and codependent that things are constituted by each other to such a degree that there's no real way, no principled way of distinguishing one thing from another thing in any real sense, right? Even though they are all also simultaneously really distinct from each other, right? So that's how I get to identity. I follow the codependency, the interdependence of things, right? And the endless, ceaseless transformation of things being so constant, so spontaneous, Duran, so absolute in a sense that there is nothing to a thing other than all the things that are not it, right? Everything is what is outside of it in some sense, right? That could be potentially too Buddhistic of a reading. I would admit that. And the point about potentiality, I would say that it's not that things are potentially everything else. It's not that things are potentially the whole. I think there's an actualism in Zhuangzi. I think this is all the case from the start, in a sense, right? That by to be a thing is to be something that distinguishes itself from its context, from everything else, and thereby have everything be so dependent upon it and be within it that it ultimately is it while remaining truly distinct from it. So I'm trying to get, I don't know if successfully, I'm trying to get as close as possible to the intrinsic sort of fact of this identity and difference relationship within each distinction, that is each thing, each value. So I that it's hard to put into words, obviously, but that's as best as I could do for now.
Thank you very much. I get your actuality, not potentiality. Sure,
Yeah.
agree.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you. Dan, would you like to make your comments and ask your questions now?
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Jason. That was really great. I just have a few comments that are relatively open-ended, so please feel free to talk as much as you want about them. But they're really two interrelated issues. Um, when people generally speak of either value pluralism or monism, there's one tendency. I'm wondering if perhaps your one-all monism might avoid this tendency that um, I find somewhat unsatisfactory, especially when dealing with the Zhuangzi, which is that it somehow turns the Zhuangzi into a normative text or normative philosophy or normative thinker, however you want to phrase it, that puts it, in, I guess, competition, so to speak, with, Confucius and Mozi and Shunzi and these other normative thinkers. Um, and so I'm wondering if this one all monism might it strikes me, although I haven't put in enough thought into it. It strikes me at the moment that it somehow avoids that pitfall, which I think is a pitfall for work on the Zhuangzi. Um, but then, if so, maybe opens it up to another pitfall from the normative philosopher's perspective, which I'm thinking of, the critique that was levied at Spinoza, right? In which case, is affirming all things, does that mean not affirming anything in particular, right? So I guess from the normative philosopher's perspective, does this fall into the trap of nihilism, or in Spinoza's case, atheism, right? Um, so basically, these two things I find somehow problematic from each perspective, right? Um, value pluralism tends to, and monism tends to reduce the text. I think of it as a reduction into a normative philosophy. And then on the other hand, the affirmation of all things implies that you don't affirm anything in particular. So I was wondering if you have a response to those two concerns.
Yeah, sure. Great. That's good stuff. So on the first question about whether or not the reading turns Strong's into a normative thinker, um, yeah, okay. So I have defended in print the idea that the Chuangzi can be read as a moral error theorist text in some form or another, which could be cashed out in terms of value nihilism. That the text itself can be read in a way as defending a type of view which says that every moral or thus every axiological or every metanormative judgment is false. Why is it false? Because there's nothing to which it ultimately refers, because metaphysically, normative properties fail to obtain in some way, right? So, the failure of names for Taoism in general to truly track any mind-independent reality made me think that there's something error theoretic going on in Taoism, especially in Zhuangzi. But yeah, even in Lao Tzu too, right? I mean, if heaven and earth are humane, that then they're not instantiating the primary moral or normative feature of the world that you get from Confucianism. So, is the Chuangzi a normative text? Is he a normative thinker from the perspective of Confucianism? No way. From the perspective of Moism? No way, right? So he's moral anti-realist, normative anti-realist. He seems to think on some level that these sorts of judgments, normative judgments, axiological judgments, altered sorts of value judgments, they're false in some way, that they don't succeed, they don't capture anything, right? There's nothing of which they truly speak. Now, on the other hand, right, through this affirmative move that you've noticed, right, there seems to be a few moments meta-ethically, meta-normatively, axiologically in the Zhuangzi. On the one hand, you can get an error theoretical view of value nihilism. And then if you look closer, keep going, you realize actually he goes the exact opposite route and says absolutely everything is right. Absolutely everything is good, right? Absolutely everything is yin sure. It's the rightness of the present this, right? So there's no judgment. There's no assertion, no proposition that's not axiologically, meta-ethically, meta-normatively true, right? There's the affirmative side. Now, you asked if that means that you can't affirm each thing by affirming all things. But I think you can only affirm all things by affirming each thing in particular. The affirmation of each concrete particular thing, value, normative judgment, whatever, is the affirmation of them all. So, what is the consequence of this? It's either something like moral or axiological dialethism, where every moral or value judgment turns out to be true, right? Because they all obtain, right? Or it's even crazier, something like moral trivialism or axiological trivialism, which not only some contradictions, not only some moral or value contradictions are true, but indeed absolutely all of them, and each one of them in particular are all true. Now, why would he hold such a crazy, paradoxical, contradictory, dialethical, trivial view? I think it's because of the therapeutic upshot that comes from that, right? So there I would see the similarity with Spinoza even more, right? If you want the full, dose of, third kind of knowledge, blessedness, if you want to really fully understand and identify and feel the joy and love that comes from knowing what it is, then you have to see each concrete, particular, finite thing through its formal essence as being identical to God or nature, to speak in Spinoza's terms. To speak in Taoist terms, each surfeit distinction, each thing, each value is identical to the entirety of all of them, to the whole field, to the whole, to the Tao, to the one thing that is each one of them, right? I think that gives you the immortality, the joy, the sort of therapeutic upshot and benefit from the entire approach. So that's the complicated way, I guess, of answering your two questions. I don't know if they're, again, more frustrating or not, but I feel like that's the best I can do for now.
Yeah, thank you. That's quite I guess satisfying in a way. But I was also just to follow up. I mean, is there room for neither affirming nor disaffirming all things?
I
Right? Is there, I
I
mean,
don't
does one all monism demand one to affirm or disaffirm or to take any perspective on affirmation or even remove oneself from the realm of axiology?
I'm on the one hand, yes, because it's never a mere relative value affirmation, right? I think what happens in the
Hmm.
Chuangzi is that instead of going the nihilist route only, right, the abolitionist or the error theoretic route only, it goes through it to the other end and comes out almost horseshoe theory style and ends up being so affirmative that no real non-affirmation is possible in the end because everything is already intrinsically self-affirming, and your job is just to say yes to that, right? That's your sort of therapeutic goal, I think, in the text, perhaps your ethical goal,
Yeah.
right? Now, of course, you got to say yes to a bunch of nasty stuff, but now we're entering sort of Nietzschean eternal recurrence sort of territory. So, but yes, I think the answer to your question is no. In the end, you can't escape affirmation, right? That it's something that's
Hmm.
already the case almost ontologically. So to aim to avoid it somehow, right? To hang out to the side of it or something like that is not really a plausible option because that itself is already a weak affirmation. Yeah.
And presumably this would also be without any sort of hierarchical prioritization
Yeah,
of
that's
that which we affirm.
exactly. Yeah, that's the whole
Okay.
point of denying
Okay.
priority value monism, which I think is the actual
Okay.
name, should be the name of the view of most value monists, the priority monists about
Yeah,
value.
right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
Yes, like Isaiah Berlin's of the world. And yeah,
yeah, sure.
great. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks.
Thank you both for these questions and these exchanges. Now we can move to our second speaker, Professor Zhu Jinjing. You have 10 minutes to present. If you have
Can
any
you see
trouble with sharing,
can you see my screen?
yes, yes.
Okay, great. So, it's my screen. Okay. Now it's clear, the screen? Okay, great. So today I'd like to talk about how actually quite undermined study of mystical experience in the Zhuangzi, how the mystical experience can elucidate the paradoxes in the Zhuangzi. We all know that the Zhuangzi is filled with all these different sorts of paradoxes. For example, the paradox of the self, whether the Zhuangzi deny all the senses, intellects, emotions, or whether there's a truer version of the self that is to be affirmed. And then there's also the paradox of the Tao, whether the Tao is transcendent or whether it's the whole, the complete cosmological totality, or whether no matter its totality or the transcendental Tao, it's to be deconstructed and everything should go to the things, right? And then there's the third paradox of one and many, as Jason just talked about, whether it's pluralism or monism. All these paradoxes are present in the Zhuangzi text. But usually we tend to examine these paradoxes from a philosophical perspective. But today I would like to use two stories in the Zhuangzi, that is the Huzi story in chapter 7 and the Lady Yu story in chapter 6. Both stories are filled with the strong undertone of mystical experience. So recently wrote a paper about how the two stories tell us about the mystical experience in the Zhuangzi and compare it with the Western mystical tradition. But after I write that paper, I think I realized that the mystical experience actually might help us understand the paradoxes in the Zhuangzi better. So I would like to proceed to the mystical experience stories. So I divide these two stories roughly into 4 stages. And each stage, we would see how that stage talks about the paradox of the self and the paradox of the Tao, and then the paradox of the many. So as you can see in this table, all these black words are already explicitly talked about in the stories, but the gray ones are what I infer from what already is present in the text. So I'd like to start with stage 1. So in the stage 1, the mystic in the story seems to be not living, and it demonstrates the kind of pattern of the earth. So it explicitly talks about the denying of the finite self. And through this denying of the finite self, there's also the denying of the world and the things. So by externalizing the entire realm and externalizing the things, we also externalize our life. So altogether, we give out our finite self as well as giving out the things. So in this sense, we are also purifying the multiplicity of the things, because the world and things is displaying multiplicity as the empirical world. So this is stage 1. But in stage 2, we see immediately a revitalization of the self. It's explicitly raised as in terms like soil of heaven. By far, we see this is a very common phenomenon in the mysticism tradition across many traditions, cultures. But this is not only a revitalization of the self, but it is also a kind of transcendent self. It is actually expressed through the term seeing in the solitude. So by solitude is a very special word in the Zhuangzi. So solitude first means independence. So the self is independent from the world or even from our own senses and intellects, so that there is a truer sense of self within this kind of going beyond this dependence on the world. So there's an independent self that is truer, and that is the revitalized self. So the second sense of the solitude is to see, because it is independent of all the multiplicity of the things, this is also the kind of oneness. So solitude is already an implication of oneness. So in this sense, I would call this is because solitude is not something within the cosmos, within the cosmological view. So I would say this is a transcendental leap. It's a leap of transcendence to go beyond our ordinary life, to reveal a truer version of the self that is independent of the world, and that is also, stand on its own. But this oneness is not only the transcendental self, I would say it's also the transcendent Tao, because by this solitude, there's also no past and no present, no destruction and no generation. So these words are all very, high profile words that are beyond our ordinary sense, ordinary intellects. And so that I would say it's a kind of transcendent manifestation of the Tao, especially also from the word, the good source of all things. So by the source of things and the good source of things, the Tao is manifested as a kind of transcendent. I would say here, I know, just as we talked just about the Tao, sometimes is the kind of totality, the whole. But I would say in these two stories, the Tao seems to be a more transcendent version. So this is the good source of all things, and that is independent of all things, and that is the pure oneness. That is the oneness that is beyond the multiplicity of the things. So this pure oneness is not only the truth of the self, but also the truth of reality. That's the second stage. So this is definitely a leap of transcendence, I would say. And then there's the third stage, I would call it the stage of reconciliation. This is expressed in the famous word of the ultimate emptiness and the impulsion to balance qi. I would say the ultimate emptiness would be a demonstration of the transcendent Tao, and the balancing of the qi would be the presence of the concrete qi. So in this sense, Tao is not only manifested as kind of transcendent oneness or emptiness, but it's also displaying itself in the concrete qi. So that's the concrete part of the word that Tao immersing into. So that's the co-presence of the transcendent Tao and the concrete word. And then in this sense, by balancing of the qi, we also see the qi affirms the multiplicity, the boundary of things and the perspectives on the one hand. On the other hand, by qi, it also connects them all into this totality or into this oneness together. So I would say in this picture, we would see a coexistence of one and many together. So going back to the version of self, this is where I infer from the Tao and the one and many paradoxes. I would say here, by dwelling in the ultimate emptiness, this is a version of transcendent self. But by embracing the impulsion to balance qi, we would see a kind of finite self reappearing. So in this sense, we see, for example, the fasting of the heart mind, the story, ultimately results in a kind of reconfiguration of qi, as well as a reconstruction of the body and the heart mind. So this is where we see the self in the Zhuangzi usually is reaffirmed rather than totally denied, or a total version of transcendent self in the previous, compared to the previous two stages. This is stage 3. And then lastly, in stage 4, this phrase, "I begin to emerge from my source," actually is a little tricky to explain. My explanation is that the transcendent Tao is so omnipresent in all the things that there is no need for us to retain this Tao, still hold on to this Tao. So that would result in the deconstruction of the transcendent Tao. And then by the deconstruction of the transcendent Tao, we see a total return to the multiplicity of the things and perspectives. So, and mapping back to the self, we would say the returning to the multiplicity of the things would also be a returning to the multiplicity of the self, or returning to the finite self. So we see at the end of the mysticism experience, we would see a total returning to the ordinary life, to deconstruct any transcendent Tao and to empower all the multiplicity of the things themselves. So how this multi-stage mysticism story tells us about the paradoxes of the Tao. I would say, first of all, it transforms our view of whether this is a philosophical or logical choice problem to a multi-stage or multi-facade possibility. So rather than having to choose one out of the 3 or 4 options from the paradoxes, we can actually we can actually see that all these 4 options could be present in the Zhuangzi. And this is maybe not very clear in these philosophical arguments, but in the mysticism stories, we already see a very explicit display of all these possibilities. And then each option, I would say each option in the paradoxes would be valid in its own condition. Once we grant the possibility that all these options in the paradox can be true, then we don't have to choose out of so many, so that we can fully develop each options that's possible. For example, the purification of the self and the things would be important for us to, the self-transformation of the self-cultivation theme that is very prevalent in early China, right? And the transcendental Tao and the pure oneness and the transcendental self is crucial because I think it's important in the Zhuangzi because we could see there is certainly a leap of transcendence in the Zhuangzi that's already present in the Taoism, not necessarily so much in Confucianism, but Taoism definitely makes this move. And I would say the reconciliation stage is the most intriguing part, as Jason just said. So how you coexist both one and many, both the transcendent self and the finite self. And this balancing, this reconstruction is the most intriguing part, and I would say the most important part out of these 4 stages. And why is stage 4 important, I think, is because as long as we still have a kind of transcendent version of the Tao, and that kind of transcendent version can become like meta value or meta Tao that overarches all these multiple things, so that we cannot really give the true validity to all the multiplicity of the things. So in order to fully giving power to the multiplicity of the things themselves, we have to somehow give up the transcendent Tao, so that each thing is really grounded on its own rather than still dependent on any transcendent Tao. So that's how I picture these 4 stages into the different paradoxes in the Zhuangzi. And I would say it's still a general paradigm or general framework, and all the questions remain to be addressed rather than closed. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jinjing. Now, Dan, would you like to start with your comments and questions?
Yes, thank you very much, Zhu. So I have a few comments on this. Very interesting, by the way. I'll start off this. I guess, would you call it a process? A process of these paradoxes? It seems like that's how you're describing it.
Yes, no problem.
Okay, yeah. I'm wondering what other contemporary discourse are you? I might not be familiar with sort of, I guess, the writings on mystical elements of the Zhuangzi and potentially theology, but I'm just curious if what other discourse, contemporary or otherwise, this is connected to.
In my paper, actually, I related to the mysticism literature. For example, Ross does a lot on the mysticism of the Zhuangzi, and also if you go to the Western literature, that would be Stace or James. There's all these kind of classical texts written around before the 1950s in the last century. There's a lot of classical texts about how the variety of mystical traditions, how whether we can reach a common common human experience, common human mystical experience, or whether they demonstrate varieties. So these are the literature that I relate when I wrote this paper. Yes. And regarding the process, I would say the Huzi story actually is like the Sherman Xian comes to see Huzi, and at different time period, the Huzi displays different facades of himself to the Sherman. So that's the Huzi story. And regarding the Lady Yu story, actually it's contextualized in the teaching of the Dao. So how the Dao is displayed, or later you actually teaches the Dao to the person called Pu Liangyi about how the Dao is manifested or how the Dao should be learned. And these are the different there's no explicit separation in that story to say this belongs to this stage and that stage. But I would say if we compare it to the Huzi story, then we can roughly divide it also into roughly 4 stages of this process. That's what I would say.
Okay. Now another concern, totally unrelated, but well, maybe somehow connected, is that when treating, I think this type of concern kind of also concerns the Laozi, right? Which is, of which there's many texts, or there's many scholars and there's traditions that treat texts like the Zhuangzi or the Laozi as advocating a transcendent Tao, a Tao that's higher than the Confucian Tao, right? This is sort of like the typical picture of how Laozi and Kongzi relationship is, right? That the Laozi is advocating a Tao that's somehow spiritually higher. However, for both texts, for both the Zhuangzi and the Laozi, right? If you do that, you sort of become hoisted by their own petard, right? Because so much of the text, both the Laozi and the Zhuangzi, are dedicated to problematizing the debate itself about which Tao is better, or in the Zhuangzi, it's framed as the Shifei Bian, right? Shifei Bian. And so I'm wondering, how does this system, or how do you personally respond to that problem, that it appears that one of the issues the text is dealing with is problematizing this debate over Shifei. One of the things that the Laozi, for example, problematizes is the notion of holding one Dao, or one sort of side of the yin yang scale as higher than the other, sort of ends up subverting that. So with discussions about Dao, the Zhuangzi's Dao or the Laozi's Dao being higher or better or more transcendent than other Dao, I'm wondering how you might respond to that.
Okay, actually, your question contains a lot of sub-questions. I try to break them down. So first of all, why do I think the Dao in Taoism, for example, in Zhuangzi and Laozi, is more transcendent than the Dao in Confucianism, right? I would say this is actually from my own reading of, for example, the Book of Ritual. When I read all those, like the book of music, right? 乐记, these parts, all these heaven and earth parts, and even the book of change, all this heaven and earth, initially I thought that's the kind of already the metaphysics, but in the end I realized that's cosmology. This is also the question I asked Jason, whether the Tao is the cosmological one that is within or contained within the cosmos, or that's moving beyond the Tao. And why I would think Taoism moves more transcendently, because first of all, Tao as the source of all things, that's the beginning. the inquiry into the beginning of the cosmos. That's already a move. That's further than we just talk about the totality of the things. Totality, we are still immanent. You are still immanent in the cosmos. But if you talk about you go beyond to the beginning, you go beyond to the source, that's already making that move. But that's not the whole story. The whole story, the deeper story, especially for Zhuangzi, I think there's a lot of inquiries about the infinite part. For example, the Qiushui chapter. The Qiushui chapter, when we talk about those little and small, right? The debate between the little and the small, actually, the Zhuangzi totally undermine this debate in that chapter, in the sense that if we push the problem of small and big to the extreme, we would see that's the kind of infinite world that our intellect cannot grasp. That's the thing. I think the kind of infinity, moving beyond our finite life, finite world, to that kind of infinite world that's going beyond our intellect, going beyond our human capacity. That's why I would call that's the word, that's the kind of leap that might be greater, as we can see in the Confucian text. That's my take. And then regarding your point on the right and the wrong, I'm not sure whether I get your point correctly, but you seem to say that if we immerse into the debate, the back and forth, the interdependence between right and wrong, then that what seems to be defeating the transcendent Dao, because it seems that if we, let's say, the Qiulun, if we want to resolve the problem of Qiulun, no matter by this one in all monism, or whether we want to address it in this kind of pluralism or this kind of relativism or interdependence between perspectives, right? There seems to be no mentioning of the transcendent Dao. But I would say the pivot of the Dao, the Dao Shu part, the pivot of the Dao, there's certainly at least initially, when the Zhuangzi starts with the debate between Shi Fei and Bi Shi, there's certainly a move that the Zhuangzi want to take to say that let's go beyond, right? 彼是莫得其偶, let's go beyond the debate of right and wrong. There's a need to go beyond of that, because if we still immerse into the debate, we cannot really go out of it. So we need to think out of the box. So I think Dao Shu in the first place is to say that we need to transcend this debate. We need to transcend this relativism. But in the end of the story, the Zhuangzi say that when we 照举天, we appeal to the heaven, we appeal to the pivot of the Dao, we still go back to this 因事, right? 照之于天, 一因事也. So in the end, the whole story still go back to each individual thing, each situated, contextualized thing in their finite life. So that's why I position this. That is also why I position this 4 stages, because I think there is a move to go beyond, but then there is also a move to come back. I don't think these two are necessarily contradictory, because in the first place, we need to go beyond. Otherwise, we are just totally immersed in this kind of forever debate, endless debate. But then if we go, we move, we make the transcendental move, we still need to come back, because the transcendental move might be empty, might be too elusive, or might be nihilism. So we have to come back to this kind of reality in which all things are situated and finite and in their own perspective. I think my reading of the Qiulun would be consistent with my reading with these 2 stories. That's my quick response.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll save. I have more to talk to you because I find your project very interesting, but I'll of course save the time here for Jason to respond.
Thank you.
Jason,
Yeah,
please.
thank you. Yeah, that's really great. I really enjoyed the paper too, and I like your whole approach here with this 4-stage process of mystical experience. I think I had two questions basically. I wanted to ask about the relationship between the levels themselves. I kind of want to ask you what you've asked me. Do you think that each stage contains within itself the other stages so that there's really, I don't know how to put it, like, by the time at the end, that you've returned after revitalizing and recuperating and, reconciling yourself with things through this mystical experience, have you really left? Like, have you gone anywhere? Is this not just a return to where you were to begin with, in which, you already had it in a sense, right? So I wonder about I guess, I don't know, the trivial implications of that, the paradoxical nature perhaps between the levels themselves, that each level in a sense contains or entails or already is each level. So you can, in a sense, at each level go to all of the other three simultaneously. Um, so that was one question about the levels there. My other question was broader, I guess. I wanted to ask if you've ever thought about how similar this might be to other mystical traditions. The whole schema, the paradigm that you use, kind of reminds me of the ox herding pictures in Zen Buddhism, like the 10 bulls. So I was just wondering if there's any structural similarity there, because the ending of that whole narrative is the same. You've returned to society, back to kind of where you started after having, you chase the bull, you tame it, you ride it, you realize you don't exist, it doesn't exist. You go to the source and you come back and there's something pretty bodhisattva-like about it that you return to where you started. So I was just wondering if there was perhaps a superstructural sort of similarity in other mystical experiences that you found. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Jason, for these two wonderful questions. I think the first question, containment or entailing the next stage, I would say maybe stage one and stage two are already a natural influence, because once we begin purifying ourselves and denying our finite self, there would be a risk of a nihilist self. But the problem is, as with and also answering your second question, as with many other traditions of many other cultural traditions in the mysticism tradition, this kind of denying of the finite self seems to be automatically linked to a revitalization of self. This is a very common phenomenon observed in a lot of mystical traditions. So that I would say, might be already a containment, or at least a quite automatic or spontaneous entailment. But what I think is, but I would not say they contain each other, because maybe this kind of containment issue is not present in my mind. I would think about it later. But for now, I would not say they mutually contain each other, especially, for example, when you talk about the union stage, the kind of oneness and the kind of coexistence of one and many, as you talked about. This seems to be not automatic, because I would say not for example, the states, right, the classical mysticism scholar states, he differentiates between two kinds of mysticism. One is called introvertive mysticism, in which one is the ultimate goal, and one is ultimately manifested as the self-consciousness, the undivided self-consciousness as one. And then the other type of mysticism is called extrovertive mysticism, in which it's about reality, extrovertive in the sense of it's the external reality of the world. And in the extrovertive type of mysticism, there's a coexistence of one and many. So this pure oneness and the coexistence of one and many is what is distinguished by states as two different types of mysticism. But as you said, for example, in Buddhism, this could certainly appear in certain other traditions too. So I will not say this is exclusive to the Zhuangzi, but whether that's a common underlying human consciousness that's beyond our cognitive understanding, and whether they share some common platform, I would say maybe I would say yes, but the tricky thing about the Zhuangzi is that the stage 4, the returning stage, usually is not mentioned in the other mystical traditions. Other traditions are sure there's a purification stage, sure there's a pure oneness stage, and there could even be the external, the extrative reality that is both simultaneously one and many, but they never seems to be. Buddhism is an exception, of course. I mean, as far as I read the states, they usually don't include the returning to the ordinary life as part of the mystical experience. Oh, that's one tricky thing I want to talk about, the returning stage. So if we understand the returning stage as the kind of ordinary life, right, as the words already claim, it's a returning to the ordinary life, returning to our ordinary life and ordinary self. But the thing is that the Zhuangzi describes it as the ultimate stage in the mysticism. That means, the Zhuangzi describe 未始出五宗 or following the multiplicity, manifestation and transformations of things. The Zhuangzi does not describe it as if it's normal. It describes it as really, the capacity of the sage, the capacity of the true man who really grasp the Tao rather than who just like ordinary people. So that also makes us wondering the difference between stage 4 and stage 1, right? If let's say stage 4 is just ordinary life and stage 1 is also this ordinary life that we think so hard to purify from, then what's the point of going through all these different stages, right? That's the tricky question I ask myself many times. And then I would say my tentative answer would be all this transcendent move and all this reconciliation move is not wasted. I would say there's still a difference between the retaining stage and the things I want to purify in the first stage. Because in the end, for example, the tumultuous tranquility, right, the yinning part, we participate in the empirical world, in the multiplicity of the things, yet we still retain some kind of peace within ourselves. And how this peace is retained? This peace is retained because we go through all this transcendental move, all this ultimate emptiness. So actually, I make this gray because I'm not very sure whether this returning to the self is really a total return to the finite self. I would say still there's some kind of self that's going beyond the finite things. And even if we say when following the multiplicity of the things, there's still something going beyond, but that's not in the sense of, the transcendental value or the transcendental Tao that we want to reinforce into these things. That's not the case. So that's what I would respond by far. Thank you so much.
No, that's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for this discussion. So now I think it's time to move to our third speaker, Dan.
Okay, I'm having some severe internet problems, so I'm just going to keep my camera off. I think that maybe is improving it to some degree.
That's okay. Yeah, go ahead.
1 second. Or maybe I need to have it on to share. Oh, no, I don't. Never mind. Okay, can everybody see the PowerPoint fine? That I have just
Yes.
put up? No?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, can we see it?
Yeah,
Yes.
Dan, we can see it.
Yes, just
Okay.
enlarge it.
Yeah. Okay, so I hope you can hear me because I think my internet is really going in and out here. So first of all, thank Sihai Weishe and Paul and Jason and Jinjing, of course. So today my presentation on paradox and the Zhuangzi will focus on exploring a relationship between a specific cluster of paradoxical juxtapositions within the text and how literary tone functions within the text's more broad critical project. So the specific paradoxical elements that I'm addressing here can be described as simultaneously advocating detachment and commitment, having social and political commitments in a healthy, productive, and efficacious manner requires detachment. And then boundaries, that which the Zhuangzi is particularly or frequently described as deconstructing or dissolving, is that which in fact drives the impulse towards both commitment and detachment. So this third part I'm not going to address here for time reasons. So I'm also particularly interested in another paradoxical aspect that emerges not out of the philosophical argumentation within the text, although it's interrelated with it. That is how the literary tone of the text functions in the expression of this paradoxical phenomena in the form of tonal dissonance. So tonal dissonance refers to the abrupt juxtaposition of differing or seemingly incompatible literary tones within a passage or between passages, creating a sense of incongruity that disrupts the reader's expectations and invites reconsideration of the passage's meaning. So here how it's expressed in the Zhuangzi specifically. So generally, the text establishes a tone of freedom and transcendence, or xiaoyao, that carries the reader beyond boundaries. The tone then suddenly pivots, problematizes the possibility or desirability of being unbounded, and recognizes our embeddedness within and commitments to the social and political worlds. And the tension and incongruity here creates a tonal dissonance. So I imagine everyone is familiar with the tone of the Zhuangzi, that this sense of xiaoyao, freedom, transcendence, unfettered wandering, and soaring transcendence of Peng, right? But the passages that advocate or at least recognize socio-political commitment are perhaps a little less obvious, which is why I believe that tonal dissonance is so important. So now to move on to examples that occur within the Zhuangzi, or how tonal dissonance functions in making these paradoxical juxtapositions between detachment and commitment starkly evident. I argue this tonal dissonance happens throughout the text, but I will briefly provide here 3 obvious examples.
Dan,
So the first of
I'm
these,
sorry to interrupt you. Dan, could you
yes,
please make
yes.
the PowerPoint bigger? Like
Okay, how do we do this?
use yeah, exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Was it on just a small screen this whole time?
Yes. It's okay.
Okay, all right.
It's very beautiful. So
Yeah, you
I
just
just
wanted
wanted to
you
see.
wanted to
I want to
you
see.
wanted to see my lovely picture here, right? Okay. So the first example occurs in one of the passages describing Peng's unbounded soaring in contrast to the narrow-minded quail below him, right? And then in contrast to the 3 bureaucrat officials, Song Rongzi is also described as he simply made a sharp and fixed division between the inner and the outer, and clearly discerned where true honor and disgrace reside. He did not want to involve himself in anxious calculations in his dealings with the world. Right. So the tone here is intended to portray Song Rongzi similarly to Peng insofar as he is beyond Nei-Wai distinctions or the narrow squabbling regarding Shi and Fei that consume the quail and the 3 bureaucrats. In this sense, he is detached from the boundaries that limit the others and able to, like Peng, wander in the limitless. However, we then get a major key change, and the text says, oh, sorry. Nevertheless, there was still a sense in which he was not really firmly planted, or 虽然犹有未树也. So this comment forces the reader, or this, I would say, this tonal dissonance between the unboundedness of Peng, the seeming unboundedness or similarly unboundedness, limitless of Song Rongzi is then established with this tonal dissonance that forces the reader to reevaluate Song Rongzi ask, is detachment or the delusion of detachment preferable? This might force the reader to recognize that, like the cicada, dove, and quail, Song Rongzi laughs at the bureaucrats and thus is perhaps more like the small creatures below him. And the text thus problematizes the prioritization of detachment or commitment over one or the other. So the next example, we go to the three passages starting off the fourth chapter, Renjian Shi. In the first two passages that involve Confucius providing advice to his disciples, Yanhui and Zigao. The first passage, we have like this paradigmatic Zhuangzi sage described as moving with complete attunement to changing circumstances, adapting fluidly, and remaining uninjured by shifting dangers, right? So the first passage with Yan Hui, we get Confucius as this enigmatic figure, mystical, critiquing heroically committed ministers like Bigan, right? And then in the second passage with Zigao, Zigao approaches Confucius asking a very similar or for similar advice as Yan Hui asks. So the reader maybe expects to have a similar sort of figure as that Confucius. But again, we get a major tone shift where Confucius responds to him as there are two great constraining obligations in this world, or dajie one is fate and one is responsibility. So this utterance is actually somewhat shocking, right? Particularly when the reader has been habituated to the dominant tone of the text. Not only this, but Ming and Yi are further explained by Confucius according to the two most conventional values for any official committed to the dominant socio-political ethos of that time, which is filial piety and loyalty. Right. So once again, literary dissonance or tonal dissonance is established here, bringing the reader crashing back to earth and forced to remember their social and political embeddedness. Then finally, we get this third example of Zigong being sent to help with the funeral arrangements for Zisanghu, Meng Zhifan, and Zhiqinjiang, right? And we're first introduced to these three characters with this quote, where they're saying to one another, who can climb up above the heavens, roaming on the mist, twisting and turning around and around without limit, living their lives in mutual forgetfulness, never coming to an end. Again, we're given this like very transcendent, boundaryless, mystical scene. Zigong is sent to help them with their funeral arrangements and the funeral rites. And upon returning, he asks Confucius who these people are. We get again a tonal shift. We get this tonal dissonance because Confucius responds to him, these are men who roam outside the lines. I, on the other hand, do my roaming inside the lines. The twain can never meet. It was vulgar of me to send you to mourn for such a person. Right? He follows this up by referring to himself as saying, right, that he is punished by heaven, Tianzhe Lu Min, right? So here we get a tonal shift in which Confucius affirms his own commitments, but not in a morally superior way, right? So then the question is, with these three examples and many more within the text, and again, this is sort of a work in progress for me, is what is the philosophical function of tonal dissonance, such as in these examples? So I've come up with a few, but I'm interested to hear if Jason, Jingjing, or anyone in the audience has any ideas. So firstly, it disrupts interpretive expectations, directs the reader's attention to the paradoxical juxtapositions of commitment and detachment. Basically, the text telling the reader, hey, pay attention, this is important. Rather than resolving the paradox, the dissonant tonal shift allows the reader to return to the other side. If the reader is in the mood that they favor commitment, it helps them sort of return to detachment. If they're favoring detachment, it helps them return to commitment. And it allows them to sit in the productive tension created by dissonance and incongruity. And finally, allows for an internal critique of conventional commitments, transforming the reader's relation to them while leaving the commitments themselves intact. So yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dan. It was really inspiring. So can we start with some comments and questions? Maybe we'll start with you, Jason, this time.
Sure. Yeah, that's good stuff. Yeah, I've often noticed those kind of experiences of whiplash as well when reading Chuangzi. I guess one question that popped up was, do you think that these tonal dissonances, the incongruity involved in them, do you think they themselves amount to paradox, right? To something like contradiction or true contradiction? Or are they just a sort of level below that? The tension isn't as strong as paradox, maybe. And then your last question there about possible sort of explanations for it and stuff. I'm not quite sure if I have one, but I was thinking that it was reminding me of that key distinction in the Chuangzi between having the form of a human being but lacking the characteristic inclinations of a human being. And so there needs to be a sort of reminder that you're kind of trapped in this, you're fated to have this sort of human form for now. So you still have some roles to play, even if you might be, internally gone, right? Detached. And that goes back to a whole number of sets of distinctions or approaches in the Chuangzi and in the Guozian commentary that on the one hand, your internal salvific or therapeutic or sociological achievements take you well beyond any of your social or political or human roles or functions or needs, and yet you are still, in a sense, bounded by or fated to perform these to such an extent that you either have to pretend well at them, or you have to become so embodied within them and so identify so completely with them that you're just doing both simultaneously, and thus you're really reaching a level of sort of self-contradiction or paradox, right? Where you're both human and not, and so that's just the way it is. And so the text is just trying to kind of bring us back to both sides. And because I think the text just finds that to be almost true in a metaphysical sense. But I don't know. That's all I have for now.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. So the two you mentioned, the first being, does the incongruencies or this dissonance in the text, do they themselves represent paradox? Yeah, so I think when I mention paradox, it's paradoxes within the text itself and paradoxes that the text is addressing, social and political paradox that happens in our lives and presumably the lives of the readers at the time. Um, so I think they both, when we're talking about paradoxes, the paradox is that they're put in juxtaposition within the text, right? That's the first level of paradox. Then, of course, the second level of paradoxes, these are paradoxes that we live with in our lives daily. They're paradoxes that we've sort of internalized such that we, to some degree, find them normal. And when the unfortunate philosopher uh, considers and reflects on their life and recognizes this paradox, there's two different impulses. One is, as I believe both you and Jinjing mentioned, and you're both, I think all three of us are on the same page about this, is some that try to dissolve the paradoxes, which I don't think is helpful to do in terms of reading the text, and doesn't seem to be helpful to try to do in one's personal life, right? It sounds like, Jason, you and I are probably on the same page in terms of a therapeutic of coping with the potentially negative aspects that emerge out of these paradoxical juxtapositions within our own lives, right? Rather than it's especially rather than compartmentalization. I feel like compartmentalization might cause more problems than fix them. But to be able to cope with these issues, I argue that the paradoxes within the text ultimately have, so the paradoxes as they're presented in the text rather than in our lives are there as coping strategies to therapeutize the paradoxes that we live with in our individual lives. In other words, by the text using this literary dissonance to reveal towards both commitment and detachment, it allows the reader to reflect on those paradoxes in their own lives and presumably cope with them. And then in response to your second question, actually, you kind of hit on fundamentally what drove my interest in doing this project, which is in Chinese language literature and contemporary Chinese discourse, the recognition of this advocacy for political commitment or social political commitments alongside the advocacy for detachment is generally kind of explained away by saying that the advocacy for political commitments it derives from the commentary tradition, because the commentarial tradition were all political actors, right? And so it wasn't politically feasible for them to emphasize the detachment part of it. And there was like a drive for them to advocate for increasing social and political engagement. Well, I think that's definitely true, that the commentarial tradition does emphasize those elements of it, right? I find that the literary dissonance or tonal dissonance in the text seems to highlight those passages that do emphasize political or social commitment in a way that kind of evens them out. So while there are certainly more passages that can be interpreted as emphasizing detachment, it seems like the ones like the Dajie one in particular, because it's so shocking, really, it seems to carry more weight, right? And so you mentioned, I believe it was Wang Tai, the person who like looked like a person but didn't have the moral inclinations or emotional inclinations of a person. Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of what that impulse towards both detachment and commitment is somewhat addressing, right? The recognition of the need and the fact that one is always already socially and politically embedded, but to try to sort of resolve or dissolve the impulse for zealotry or enthusiasm that causes pathological and socially dangerous emergent results, right? So Wang Tai, in my opinion, kind of represents that type of a character. The Confucius in the last example I used represents the sort of ideal sage, whereas, for example, the Confucius in the passage with Shushan Wuzhi represents this sort of zealot, enthusiastic Confucius that's totally overcome by social and political commitments. So we have all these, the whole paradigm or the whole spectrum of commitment and detachment. And I think what the text does brilliantly is really problematize every point of it on that spectrum. So I hope what I said had
That's
any
perfect.
reference
Great.
to your question.
Thanks.
Yeah,
it's really good. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Jinjing and Jason, for your questions. Sorry, it's Jinjing's turn for her questions. Yes.
I try to keep it short. I think thank you, Daniel, for pointing out this tension between detachment and commitment. I think this tension is certainly there. My question, not necessarily the question for you, but actually the question for myself and maybe for all three of us, is that the tension is there, no problem. The problem is how does this move? You see there's an abrupt redirection from detachment to commitment. But the thing is how we make this move. When you say the detachment makes us more efficacious to going back to commit in our social and political life, that means how we really go back with this detachment, with this transcendence. That's why I also say, the coexistent part, how on the one hand you have the transcendent and detachment, and on the other hand, you're going back to the commitment. This coexistence is the most intriguing part for us. And then I would also say that it seems to me that all those commentators are Confucians. Most of them are Confucians. So no wonder they would make this social political commitment and going back to this kind of social political life. But the thing is that I'm thinking, if we emphasize too much on the reconciliation part, I would say, on the one hand, there's tension between detachment and the commitment. And on the other hand, there's the reconciliation between these two, right? All these Confucian commentators, they seek reconciliation between detachment and going back to the commitment. So if we emphasize too much on the reconciliation part, would that compromise our reading of the Zhuangzi as breaking from the ordinary conventions, all these ordinary values? I would sometimes I would worry that this kind of reconciliation or the compromise, I would say, it's kind of compromise would undermine, the importance of the Zhuangzi as a break, as a brave, value breaker rather than reconciliation of the values. That's my worry. But I would say, in the Zhuangzi, there's both the reconciliation and the total breakup with the conventional values. So they are both present. I'm not sure whether these are questions or just comments.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. So firstly, I think both of your comments or your questions are actually quite overlapping, and I kind of have the same response to both of them. So firstly, I would not use the term transcendence. I would say, well, firstly, I should point out that these tonal disruptions or this tonal dissonance, they don't seem to always occur in this way that there's the broad tone of freedom and unboundedness and limitlessness, and it brings the person back to commitment. It also sometimes goes the other way, right? So, for example, in the Zhenji and Zhenren chapter, right, it starts off with the problematization of, we could call it transcendent knowledge, right? So problematizing the idea of there being tianzhi, right? Um, so it starts from the opposite way, and then it goes into saying, well, if there's tianzhi, there has to be a tianren. No, sorry, not tianzhi. Sorry, zhenzhi. If there's zhenzhi, there has to be zhenren. So it kind of moves into this idea of a somewhat more mystical, liberated, limitless idea of knowledge. Of course, that passage kind of resolves by saying, well, there's no zhenzhi and there's also no zhenren, so. Sorry, we had fun though, didn't we? So I wouldn't say. I'd point out that although, like the Laozi, there tends to be a emphasis on one side of that, and it tends to be very strong overtones of liberation and unboundedness, limitlessness, and then every once in a while, sort of bringing us back to earth. So anyway, but going back to your comment, I wouldn't say that you get pulled back to commitment with a transcendent knowledge or with a new sense of transcendence. I would use the term critical awareness because I wouldn't say it transforms the reader. It simply redirects awareness to something that was already there, right? So I think the text as a whole, and particularly these moments of tonal dissonance, the text as a whole does allow the reader to kind of step outside of their daily conventional attitudes, to imagine themselves like Peng flying above the world, or like who I refer to as the barbarian sages living far outside of the Huaxia area, or not practicing the conventional forms of ritual, right? Um, so it allows that sort of space for one to kind of step outside of themselves and look in. But then it also has this element of which it brings the reader back to their own commitments with a renewed critical awareness that I would argue, like Jason has mentioned, serves as a therapeutic function and allows them to not overcommit to their commitments, which oftentimes bring pretty disastrous and unhealthy outcomes. In terms of reconciliation, yeah, again, I would have more or less the same comment about that too. I wouldn't use the term reconciliation. I don't think these two aspects become reconciled, right? I didn't in my PowerPoint, I didn't mention boundaries, but I think one of the insights in the Zhuangzi is that it is the boundaries themselves that create the impulse to go beyond and to stay within, right? And unlike most, I would say one of the dominant ways of reading the Zhuangzi is that the Zhuangzi dissolves or 消解, or like, yeah, dissolves or like deconstructs, right? Deconstructs those boundaries. I think there's also a reading for the Zhuangzi which says, no, the Zhuangzi doesn't deconstruct them, it doesn't dissolve them, but simply points out or sort of reveals that, this is what's going on. This is part of the process by which we internalize those commitments that we have. And it's very important to recognize consciously this process, but that doesn't mean that we need to recuse ourselves of those commitments. But yeah, that seems like more or less semantics about the term transcendence or the term reconciliation. Perhaps going back to one's commitments with a critical awareness of their contingencies, of their accidental nature, um, is in fact functionally sort of a reconciliation of that, right? But thank you for your comments, Jinjing.
Thank you. My words are not necessarily yours. I would say these two terms are problematic too.
Thank you, Jinjing and Dan. Let me check. Jason, I think you have some commitment. You need to leave in about something like 10 minutes.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes?
Mhm.
Great. So it's good to know. So we can now open the floor for questions from our audience. So if anyone has a question for Jason, this would be a good time to ask. Are there any questions? I don't see any question.
I have a question
Yes,
for
Angela?
this. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah. Just I'm curious about your interpretation of identity. Yeah, from my perspective, identity implies one thing equals to the other. So they include the same things and have the same characteristics. And I wonder whether, in this sense, whether can we say each individual is identical to the one. I have two reasons. The first is that if we focus on the one, it includes many actual individuals and infinite potentials. But for each individual, it only refers to one actual individual and infinite potentials. So they include different things. Yeah, so in terms of potentiality, they are identical, but in terms of actuality, maybe they're not. And another point is that maybe the one exists independently of empirical individuals because each individual they appears, transfers, and disappears, but the whole exists constantly. Without one certain individual, the one still exists, But without a one, maybe the individual have nothing to manifest. So I guess you may have some unique interpretation of the identity. So would you please share your ideas?
Yeah, thank you. So clearly, the way I'm using the language of identity in the interpretation I'm offering is highly unorthodox to the point probably of absurdity. But I'm doing that precisely because I think that that's happening in the text itself. I think there's something happening almost, I would say, metaphysically in the Chuangzi where the identity of a thing merely as some sort of relative continuity of self-sameness, perhaps over time and space, is blown up. It explodes into a sort of indeterminacy. We could even call it, I would be willing to consider it a kind of ontic vagueness, where there's no firm borders to a thing. They kind of bleed out in every direction, and they are simultaneously firm distinctions from what they're not, as in dexicals, as surfays, but also contain, entail, and ultimately are identical to, while remaining different from, all the things that they're not. I feel that that is kind of implicitly happening in the text. Now, which notion of identity is that? It's not one that exists yet, right? It's not a normal one. It's not a non-paradoxical one or non-contradictory one, right? It's a notion of identity that you would probably only find in something like a Nicholas of Cusa or Hegel in the West, or maybe Heraclitus or something like that. It's an identity that is not different from difference. It's a little bit of both. And so why does he do that? Again, I think it's mostly for the therapeutic upshot of considering that. I can imagine many very good, scholars of comparative philosophy and Chinese philosophy, like a Brian Van Norden, like yelling at me that I'm just creating a sort of trivialist sort of trap where everything becomes meaningless and pointless. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. I think as long as you can, in Dan's sense, you can hold together and act and be normal and fulfill your social human function and also recognize perhaps the truth of something like trivialism, where identity and difference are identical and different, right? You can experience the therapeutic or perhaps mystical experience, the therapeutic upshot, while also, in a sense, not being too weird. I don't know how else to put that. I mean, I think reality itself is self-contradictory to the point of trivial, and that still allows us to be normal and live normal lives and speak normal terms and do all the things we would do if we didn't believe those things. So you can offend against good and common sense, you can in a sense destroy them, and then you can recuperate them and identify them as being absolutely the case and hold both at the same time. So yes, it's a notion of identity that's not like the normal notion of identity where I say like this is a cup, it's not like that. I'm saying this is a cup and also it's everything else. This isn't merely a sort of Blakean point where I'm saying you can see infinity in a grain of sand. I'm saying the grain of sand is infinity. It both is just the mere grain of sand and it's everything else, right? And I think that that's what the Chuangzi is trying to get us to feel, consider, think about, identify with, and then experience the benefits of having that thought. Now, you could flip out after having that thought too. You could kind of lose your mind, but you don't have to, in a sense. And I think this is what Dan is really good at showing here, is that we can, in a sense, go back to normal everyday life while having this in the back of our head or something like that. Could we actually fully, completely live in accordance with something like a global trivialism? Probably not. But then trivialism would say that was true anyway, right? So it's not really a problem, I guess. I don't know. That's how I try to answer your questions.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Angela, for your question. Let me read the question in the chat by IU. It's worth asking, I guess it's to all three speakers, why has there been so little systematic critique and reflection within the scholarly community on the possible fallacies in traditional commentaries and the doctrinal paradoxes they thereby generate? All current standard commentaries are ultimately grounded in Guo Xiang's edition. Yet, if Guo's own interpretation has already deviated from the original meaning of Zhuangzi, then later commentaries inevitably fall into a circular reasoning trap. In light of this, I have undertaken a new annotation of the inner chapters based on multiple criteria: philological exegesis, historical evidence, stylistic analysis, and logical coherence, thereby completely abandoning Guoxiang's textual foundation and establishing an independent interpretive framework. So I will just summarize this, or maybe transform it into a question, because it doesn't really look like a question. Yeah, can you, I don't know, address the issue about concerning the limits of the commentaries and the limits on interpretation based on the fact that we have Guoqiang's edition? Like, can you refer to this textual matter if you think it's worthwhile?
I'll take a stab at it, because what the person who asked the question is doing is interesting in two different ways, right? Because it seems like they're sort of stepping on toes in the Western sort of academic community by assuming that there's a yuanyi, right? There's like an original meaning to the text that gets perverted by later commentaries. But also, they're and I'm not saying this as a criticism of the questioner, but I just found it interesting. There's also sort of not attending to the way that the classical texts have been read throughout their whole tradition, which is generally along with the commentaries. So the commentaries are not simply attempting to explain the original meaning of the work they're commentaries of, but are supplemental work, right? So any reading during any time period is always going to sort of, I know, have fallacies, so to speak. So in that sense, are there any fallacies? Maybe I'm getting back to Jason's all one modism, but I would argue that Guoxiang, Changsheng, Lin Xi, Wang Fuzi, these people are very important to understanding the text because they represent how the text was read at certain times throughout the text history, right? And it's very it's standard for Chinese scholars to read the Zhuangzi in light of those scholars, right? Now, on the other hand, most Western sort of hermeneutic scholarship would problematize the idea that there is a original meaning that the later commentators distorted or defiled or whatsoever, right? So I think both of those elements are really like tough nuts to crack. So in a sense, the person who asked the question here, Ayu, is addressing two very difficult problems that exist in Zhuangzi scholarship, or all Chinese or any textual scholarship whatsoever.
Thank you, Dan. I think another question embedded in the comment by Ayu is whether we can, whether we are talking about avoiding the paradoxes. For example, Jinjing talked about diffusing the paradoxes. So that's another, let's say, fundamental question. Like, what do we do with them? I mean, both you and Jason talk about basically living with them and drawing out the philosophical content, but there is also this approach. Maybe it's more influenced by Western perceptions of the paradox, that it has to be avoided or somehow cured because it functions like a glitch in reality and in our perception of it. Thank you, Jason. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jason. Bye.
So do we have any more questions from the audience for Jingjing and Dan?
Actually, I can also reply a little bit about the Chinese commentary tradition.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, I think it would be difficult for us to totally dismiss this tradition because I think Guoxiang, as well as many other commentators, do provide us actually quite deep level of philosophical depth, I would say. I mean, we can come up with new ideas about the Zhuangzi, but then how would you make your argument somehow consistent, at least with the text. I mean, not necessarily the original meaning of the text, but at least with the appearance of the text, the words in the text. Of course, we can see we always try to grasp the real meaning beyond the text. But sometimes once we have a stepstone that give you sufficient grounding of sufficient philosophical depth, then it would be difficult for us to totally dismiss it. But then we could also think about our current scholarship, right? Both the Chinese scholarship and the Western scholarship. We need to build up from each other. So we don't really, come up with ideas that totally just out of our own brain. We have to respond to other scholars, right? That's the reality we have to deal with. But not necessarily all the commentators will, we all depend on, will be all just elaborations of Guo Xiang. They can have different elaborations. But of course, there's still the problem of whether the commentary tradition is a kind of continuity from the past scholars, or whether you can really make new moves, real new innovations. That would be that calls for philosophical depth and creativity. I would say that's not so easy to claim, I would say.
May I say
Thank
something
you,
about
thank
this
you.
question?
Of course.
Okay, thank you. I guess this audience is thinking about the formation of Zhuangzi. Actually, in pre-Qing period, all the books they are not formed as a formal books. So that's why there are different versions of one classical books. Just in the Han Dynasty, people start to polish and edit them as an entire book. As for Zhuangzi, some some text in pre-Qing periods says it includes only 29 chapters, and many texts in the Han Dynasty says it include 52 chapters. And the version we see today, it includes 33 chapters, so it is settled down by Guo Xiang. So actually, if we only interpret this 33 chapters, I guess it's hard to get the initial meaning. Yeah, because the addition is made by someone later than Zhuangzi. I guess I remember that one author, he tries to find the original meaning of Zhuangzi by collect some pieces of thoughts from other texts that were written in pre-Qing period. So maybe you can look at this book. Yeah, but actually, I think this question is difficult to solve completely, because in pre-Qing period, actually, many books were written by philosophical schools. For example, the Analogues, it includes the saying and behaviors of Confucius, but it also was recorded by his followers, and it also includes some thoughts of his followers. So, yeah, just so we can get the core meaning of these classical books.
Thank you, Angela. There is a little time left. I wonder if I could ask a question. Is there anybody else? No. So, thinking, yes, I will somehow echo Jason's parallel, to make this parallel. Like listening to you present these 4 stages, I thought about 山是山，水是水, this kind of development, this kind of returning. So I'm just asking because I just want you to just talk a bit more about this, because it's a very rich approach, I think. So to transcend transcendence, basically. Yeah, I would like to understand how this works, because you talk about the leap of transcendence, but then you say we have to come back. But what we come back to, because the transcendent Tao is already so present in all things, right? In all perspectives. It is already in the multiplicity. I'm sorry about the noise. That it is deconstructed, right? So we return to some kind of, what is it? A kind of like thinner version of transcendence. Like we start with thick, and then we go to something thinner, because you say it's not completely dissolved, right? So I wonder how this works. Like you're describing something which is very interesting. It's something like a reverse kind of epiphany. I don't know how we would call it in Greek. Like, I don't know, antiphany, hypophany, some kind of going back into the, not coming out into the light, right? But going back into the darkness of the obscure of the multiple. So yeah, I just want to hear a little bit more. And I would also point out that there is this, maybe there is a structural similarity with what Dan says when he says that we're crashing back to the earth. So maybe there is like a kind of, yeah, he's describing the same movement, but of course with, different starting points. So would you like to say some more?
Thank you very much, Dimitra, for your wonderful further question about this overall picture. I would start with the simple. I would say, I graduated from Cornell University, and I received my training in Singapore and the US. When I was there, I realized many of the scholars have great reluctance to accept transcendence. The whole metaphysics is deconstructed in the Western academia already. But when I come back to China, I realize like the Chinese scholarship are also very very persistent in insisting the transcendence of Tao. So I'm sort of stuck in between. So I tried very hard to try to reconcile this whole picture in my mind. That's the background. And then another thing, for stage 4, for example, when I read, for example, Chet Hansen in the first place, he talks about multiple Taos, right? There's no monistic Tao, there's only multiple Taos. So all the perspectives are multiple Taos. There's no transcendent or monolithic Tao at all. I had difficulty in understanding that because I also had a Chinese mind. But then I realized, and I also read some Taiwan scholarship, for example, Lai Xisan Lao Shi, they try to position Zhuangzi as some kind of horizontal philosophy. There's no vertical, the transcendental Tao above, and then there's not the things and the perspectives, they can mutually talk with each other and they can reconcile with each other instead of appealing to any kind of transcendental Tao. Then I try to slowly catch up with what they are having, they might have in their mind. I think it might be because, as long as you have some kind of ultimate value out there, you cannot really grant each thing or each perspective their ultimate value. You need to grant each thing to the most, to the extreme, like giving the ultimate affirmation that you just go ahead. There's nothing above you. There's nothing ultimate there you need to pursue. Only in this sense we can understand Dao Zai Shi Ni, or the Dao is within the lowest thing in the world. So I then begin to understand why the deconstruction of Dao is so necessary. But then still I do think that there's a leap of transcendence in Taoism, because all those things we don't come to the ordinary world just by the ordinary world itself. That's the thing you ask, 山是山，水是水. That's also the Buddhism. We usually get criticized. It's trivialism, right? If you start with the ordinary world and going back to the ordinary world, then what's the point of going through everything? I don't think that's a question to be easily answered, but I'd like to push in that direction. Why this kind of leap the Western tradition, no matter it's the Christian tradition or the Greek philosophy, there's something that's beyond our capacity. There's something that's not immediately observable or immediately comprehensible by our human mind. And we need to recognize our finitude. I think our finitude need to be recognized rather than we deny everything. We say that we are the greatest. Okay, there's one more thing relevant to this is, the New Confucianism, Mou Zhongshan, those people, those well-known, respected scholars, that's one famous word called immanent transcendence, right? Immanent transcendence is very similar to what we are talking about. That's both transcendence and immanence, and then we need to bring them together. But I have very much difficulty in this bring together, because this bring together is never easy. That's why I say stage 4 is the task of the sage. It's not the task of ordinary people. Similarly, the immanent transcendence is not task of ordinary people. It's difficult to achieve. We cannot just say everyone can achieve immanent transcendence. Although it's a very perfect and great ideal that everyone could hope for, in reality, we can't take this for granted. If we take this for granted, then we don't start this self-perfection journey at all. At the bottom of the at the end of the day, why we read the Zhuangzi, we want to perfect ourselves. We want to perfect the world. But if we want to perfect ourselves, and then we start by boldly claim that we already have the capacity of immanent transcendence in ourselves as an actuality, then we can never really start anywhere. So that's why I would say the push to go for transcendence is important. That's what I call in their own condition. Each option is valid in their own condition, because in order for us to start our self-perfection journey, this leap is necessary. We cannot just say we go back to the ordinary and we are safe and we are already sages. No, we are not sages. So that's why we need to take this transcendence move. And that's how I understand, part of my understanding about this transcendence. And why it has to come back is, of course, we live in a very authoritative world. Sometimes authority is what we are yearning for too. But that's to a point, to a degree. We can't push it this too far that authority dominates all, right? So we need to leave space for a void space, for a kind of vacuum in which the horizontal order is possible, rather than the higher and lower dialogue. It's only in the higher and lower dialogue. So that's why I see the scholarship, wherever they are heading to, whether it's for transcendence or whether they are heading for total deconstruction, for a total flat world, for a total horizontal world, I try to understand them. This is actually how I try to understand them and try to place them together. But I don't say this is the end of the story. I'm still thinking. So thank you very much for your question.
Thank you, Jinjing. So since we don't have any more questions, I think we can say goodbye to our speakers. Paul?
Yeah, thank you guys so much. Yeah, we are out of time. And I really want to thank especially Dan for putting this together, but also for Jinjing, Jason, and Dimitra for hosting and sharing your thoughts and such. So this is the last Sahai Weisha event until September, so we'll take a little break now. And I think it was a great way to end the academic year. So thank you very much, everyone.